Hello everyone, it's us again. If you haven't subscribed our channel, please do, because we're going to do some fun talks in the future and this episode as well.
In this video, we're going to talk about a hot topic, which is discrimination in China. This has been experienced recently by many people, especially in the city of Guangzhou in the south, by people of African origin. We think it's important to address this issue because it's very prevalent. A lot of people have been the victim of it, but it's very new in the regards that people haven't really discussed it much before. They haven't really thought about it much, and they might be quite surprised that it exists. And they're also not really sure exactly what form it takes and the mindset of people who are doing these actions.
Yeah, I got to admit, actually, racial discrimination specifically is actually very, very new in the Chinese context. It wasn't actually addressed very much in all kinds of forms that we,
like in education
all
or
kinds
media,
of information that we get. It wasn't like a problem like people were actually aware of. That I think caused some problem, like people are actually conduct some discrimination like behaviors, but they didn't realize it, or maybe what they think is actually not considered as a discrimination. I think it's important for Chinese to know like some actions can be offensive and can be recognized as a discrimination for foreigners, which if we don't understand the culture enough. We also want to actually to tell like people who doesn't really know much about the Chinese culture and history that actually the reason why we have those kind of issues is quite different from the Western perspective. Chinese think or say that they think foreigners, especially Caucasians, enjoy some kind of privilege in the Chinese society.
Obviously, as a Caucasian inside China, I have quite a lot of experience of this. Primarily because compared to the size of the country and the size of the population, there's actually a relatively few number of foreigners inside China. I looked at the statistics a couple of years ago. Actually, for a percentage, China has the least amount of foreigners inside its country of any country in the world.
Really?
Yeah, because obviously the population is so large.
Yeah,
you think of it on a percentage. In China, obviously, there's 1.3 billion people, and there's about 1 million foreigners inside China at any one time. I think number one would be Koreans. That's at like 300,000. The second one is like Japanese, which is like 200,000. And then number three was people from the US, which was I think it was like 100,000. Below that was several European countries, and actually nearer the bottom was African countries. About half of those are actually, at least from the form of discrimination, they're harder to identify than say people from African or Western origin. So obviously the number is quite a few. So going back to what I was originally talking about, like the privilege, it comes apparent when you enter the workforce. Sometimes it can be easier to find a job simply because the number of foreigners is less, and sometimes the same rules don't apply that would apply to Chinese. The biggest employer of Western foreigners inside China would be in the education field, and probably 90% of those, I'm guessing here, probably would be inside teaching English. And a lot of Chinese feel that these ones who teach the English, they're not properly qualified for the role, which actually is not true actually. But I just want to point out that sometimes they feel that for the salary they're earning, which is usually a lot higher than the average Chinese salary, for the amount of qualifications they have and the amount of experience they have, they're not really warranted this high salary. So these are some kind of forms that the Chinese believe that the Caucasian foreigner has an advantage over Chinese.
Yes, I think a lot of Chinese people, common average Chinese people, they see like foreigners are actually taking a lot of privilege. A lot of things are true, were true, but a lot of things are also changing now. So in addition to the privilege, they're also not happy about some obviously behaviors, like misbehaviors, by some cases that from foreigners. For example, maybe they don't have enough qualifications for teaching, but they're actually earning a lot of money. So it's like parents sending their children and paying a big amount of tuition fee, but actually what they get is not the proper qualified education or a teacher that is actually teaching their kids. And they're also like people are complaining, maybe there are very, very few cases, but they exist there, that some foreigners are using Chinese to conduct like crimes. These are like kind of raise the conflict.
Could you give an example of using Chinese to commit crimes?
Oh yeah, I'm not saying this is common, okay? It's cases, like rare cases, but like for example, some people will use Chinese to ship drugs, like cocaines. I think cheap drugs is probably like...
Yeah, did you bring that bag I gave you?
Yeah.
It's quite valuable, just don't want to lose it now.
It's a felony in China, right? You probably get like
it's
a lifelong
also
sentence.
felony in other countries.
Yeah, so it's like you'll get a lifelong sentence in jail.
If not executed.
These are some of the cases you hear about, and obviously it's irritates some Chinese people. They would think why they should enjoy such privilege if they misbehave themselves.
On this point, I want to jump in. So often they take some of these examples and some of these things we talked about, and then it's very kind of spread out by the media, and people actually only look at like the bad points when they get they get this information through the media. So some videos will get shared in groups or through their WeChat, whatever, and then people will look at it and go, oh, look at this discrimination or these special rights that these people get. Why do they get these ones? And then you look at the kind of more negative sides of it. So actually, it's kind of taken out of context in many regards.
Yeah, and I think this is quite common all over the world. I think that people are using like a few cases to represent a whole group of people.
Going off the back of that, I then want to talk about some, on the flip side, some of the kind of like anti-foreigner discrimination which is experienced. So for the vast majority of people, there's actually very limited amount of discrimination. In the back of their mind, they might feel that the person's different, but actually they don't really express any kind of form of discrimination or even feel much kind of prejudices at all. Because obviously the population of China is so large, there's always going to be quite a few who have these kind of opinions, and they're always going to be there to kind of express them. So recently, obviously, during this coronavirus outbreak, some of the kind of already existing prejudices have come more evident. Obviously, they've been expressed by more people. So obviously, you're often treated differently as a foreigner inside China, but usually they're kind of very mild. But sometimes they can be relatively hurtful. Like some people, they feel quite strongly about it because they experience some kind of things which in their own country they'd feel was like very extreme discrimination, but perhaps in China it's not really viewed the same way. So personally myself, recently I've experienced a few cases where, for example, I'm walking down through a park, and then like this was kind of an extreme case where this kind of couple was walking, and the girl kind of like screamed and then like ran behind her boyfriend as if like I was some kind of dog. And in this case, that was kind of hurtful because I was kind of viewed as like sort of unhuman in this case. Obviously, that's kind of more extreme one, but typically when I'm walking down the street, people are a bit more cautious. They kind of see you as another. They don't know when you've arrived. For all they know, you've just got off a plane like 20 minutes ago. So they kind of feel like, I want to be wary of this guy, keep clear, he might have the coronavirus. And if they're in some kind of form of authority, they're going to ask you for that kind of more proof that you haven't got the coronavirus.
So I think a lot of things that is experienced now, a lot of Chinese maybe they didn't realize it's actually kind of form of discrimination, and is actually noticed by the foreigner, and is actually hurting them as well. So I think it's quite important to address that, because a lot of us kind of ignore the fact that a lot of foreigners, they understand, they're just human beings, they understand your language, some of them, they understand your action as well. So I think it's important that we obviously we understand like people are being cautious in a special time. I think if you meet someone who can actually walk on the streets, which probably means it's pretty safe. This discrimination has been like a hot topic all over the world, especially in the Western media. Like I think
they focus on it quite a lot.
They focus a lot on, they say, rising nationalism or rising racism. It's also important to look at our culture and our history to find that there is actually a difference between the racism happening in China and those happen in a Western context.
You kind of view the origins of this racism back in the kind of origins of the country. The Europeans were exploiting the Africans, and there was a very like kind of master-slave kind of relationship going on. So this is like the origins of racism in the West. So because of this history, actually, this in the 50s and 60s in America, the African Americans had to fight for some of their rights. This racism kind of dialogue became very conflict-based and very contentious, and people were fighting for their rights.
In American history, to address racism is to protect that group of people who has been exploited.
Yeah, protect minorities.
But actually, in Chinese history, even till maybe decades, like less than 100 years ago, Chinese are not actually the ruling parties of the country. They are actually the group, the Han Chinese people, which is the majority of the country, is actually the group who's being exploited in some way.
Exploited, yeah. The last Chinese dynasty in the Qing dynasty, that had a span of roughly 300 years. Actually, the ruling emperors and all of the ruling class, they came from a different ethnic group. They came from the Manchu people, from the northeast of China. And they actually kind of humiliated the Chinese in many ways by forcing them to shave their head and have like a ponytail, like was custom in the Manchu people's culture. And they also forced them to live in certain areas of the city. They restricted what they could do. This is actually a form of obviously control over these people, and actually was exploitation in many regards. So at that point in time, right, there's a small group of people controlling the large masses inside China.
Yeah.
So obviously when that dynasty ended and the Chinese people were kind of set free in some regards, it's actually a different origins of this kind of dialogue, right? That people don't really think about it in the same regard because the history is completely different.
Yeah.
Also inside China, it's actually a big part of the history and a big part of the education as well. Many people, Chinese people, believe that in the there's a century of humiliation from basically the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century. This was during this period they were obviously colonized by many different powers, some European powers and also the Japanese, and they were also forced to do some kind of degrading things, and they were basically being exploited by these people throughout that period. That's a part of the psyche, and obviously, so because they feel they're like the victims in this period, they're not going to perceive themselves as being the kind of bully of someone else because they feel they're the ones who are being bullied. This mindset still exists. A lot of people, very sharp in their mind, are thinking about this history, and so today, when you have some sort of larger countries, for example, the US, the UK, and Italy, inside the countries, there's some group of people who are raising the prospect of perhaps suing China. For them, they believe that this is those old kind of colonial bullies arising again to try and keep China down and exploit them. There's been some cases when I've been walking on the street and someone will stop me and say like, where are you from? I'll say, Britain. And then they say, so you burnt down the Summer Palace. And in history, right in the 1860s, like actually the British, they burnt down the Summer Palace. Actually, they viewed it as revenge for the Chinese government murdering their citizens. But obviously, that's kind of that because it's a very like national treasure in a way, the Summer Palace. It's kind of stuck in the Chinese mind that these people burnt our palace, and there's that kind of feeling for vengeance against them, which still persists to this day.
Yeah, so I think it's important, like when we talk about racism in China or discrimination in China against the foreigners, there are some like history we probably will be interesting to know before we started to address this problem, because it could be very, very different from the Western perspective. That Chinese people was the group that has been kind of lower position than, for example, the rulers or the invaders. So they see themselves finally get up, like they finally take the power, they can finally take control of the country. They still have that kind of mindset in some group of Chinese people. So I think this is something to be considered.
One more interesting thing is actually inside China, it's not just the Han Chinese people, and it's not just the Han and the Chinese. The Han and the Manchu people we mentioned before. Is actually at least 56 minority groups, probably a lot more because these groups obviously inside them contain a few different minorities. And those actually minority groups inside China have some benefits over and kind of privileges in some areas of life over the Han Chinese people. This would include, for example, if they want to go to university, it's actually slightly easier for them to do so they get some extra points. They're allowed to have more than one. Well, this policy has ended now, but previously, when Han Chinese were restricted to one child, the minority groups were not restricted, so they could have multiple children. And this actually in China does cause some kind of resentment from the Han Chinese people that, hey, these minority groups have more rights than I do. Why is this?
Yeah, a lot of Chinese are feeling unfair. They are in fact the majority of the country. A lot of policy are actually not towards them. They're kind of like in a way in a weaker position than some other groups, including minority groups, including foreigners. So that's why they sometimes easily get angry because they think they are being discriminated in their own country. Sometimes they would just get very emotional about it. Besides the history, another thing we would like to look at is the culture. The culture of the Chinese are quite different from the Western, right? Chinese society is very, very much like around the collectivism, and this idea is actually in every aspect of our life. It's deeply in our mindset, like we are a united group.
So to just like give the context, often in the Chinese culture, in Chinese society, there's a lot of the group mentality. So within China, people really do things as a unit, so all Chinese in it together. And because of the nature of that, actually they view everyone outside that as kind of other. So that's why there's some of the positive discrimination inside the workplace, because maybe Chinese, the boss or the other Chinese employees believe, okay, we have a foreigner here, he's not inside this group, so the same rules don't apply to him. The overtime, for example, they'll say, well, this foreigner, he hasn't got the same culture, so he has another kind of set of standards. Actually, this is very different from the Western style, where actually everyone in the country is meant to be treated the same. That's not true, but it's meant to be treated the same. So you're not going to have, for example, in the workplace, this guy's from a particular country, so he can perhaps go home early.
It's very different from this being more like independent, maybe in the Western culture. In China, the core of the society is that we can think and act like a group. So once you're outside that group, you're easily being like treated differently. We always emphasize like we are more powerful as a group. We need to be united. This can be good in some ways in the development of China, right? Nowadays, for example, you just mentioned like the working overtime. Some people actually, when they think as a group, they're more willing maybe to give overtime because they think it will be weird if I don't contribute to this group, right? Then it will be a bit difficult for outsiders to actually get into this group because you're not simply not the Chinese.
Yeah. And from obviously the Western perspective, most of the Western nations are not based off an ethnic group, but they're based off kind of like an area. and basically the government there is to kind of manage that area and represent the people inside that area. Whereas in China, often the government is based around the Chinese ethnic group, and it's about representing their kind of needs and wishes. So the kind of concept is quite different, right? So obviously, in, for example, England, where I'm from, if you're inside the country and you have the passport, then you're included inside that group. And obviously, for people inside the country, maybe they have some other requirements. For example, speaking English, perhaps some people have this kind of view, or adapting to the culture, where there's not less requirement on like an ethnic kind of component of it. Obviously, a very good example of this, I would say, is perhaps people who came from the Caribbean islands to the UK in the 1950s. Today they're basically indistinguishable from any other kind of British person, because they have the same command of the language. They're going to have exactly the same culture, exactly the same viewpoints and everything, and no one is really questioning if they're British or not, right? Whereas obviously, if it's based on the ethnic group, this obviously will not be the case.
I think also another reason is that China is not really a mixed society. For example, UK, you probably have a lot of different immigrants from different countries since a long time ago. But in China, we have this reform and opening like in the 70s, 80s. You think of Beijing and Shanghai as quite international now, but to the majority of Chinese people, foreigners are still quite new
Alien,
experiences for them.
So leading on from what you said about obviously having the kind of like the hive mind of the Chinese people and the kind of the group mentality, in Chinese they're very focused on unity and all working in step together. In the West, we often emphasize like diversity. Diversity makes us stronger, right? So by having lots of different viewpoints, lots of different people, different backgrounds, and different talents, we can kind of be stronger together because we have lots of different people coming together, all different sides.
Yeah.
Whereas in China, they focus very much on having the same, approaching it from the same angle, all working together to get forward.
I think obviously this is each way has its own pros and cons. I would say, for example, dealing with coronavirus in China is that because we have like a collectivism mindset, so a lot of measures seems like easier. Maybe like in news report you probably say, oh, because like we're a country that the government is so powerful. More importantly is that the people have the mindset of being a group, like we work together, of this very deep inside collectivism mindset.
Yeah.
So this is actually one important reason that helps us in doing a lot of measures that people will just follow. It will be
Overall,
beneficial for the society and
good,
for
yeah.
the community overall.
The biggest example of this is probably within the coronavirus is that wearing the mask. Obviously, it's not actually necessary to wear the mask on the street, at least inside Beijing.
It's not mandatory.
Not mandatory, right?
Yeah.
But actually, a lot of people are still wearing it just because, you need it to go inside a building, but on the street you don't need to wear it. People are still wearing it because everyone else is wearing it. I want to be part of the group. I want to do my part. So everyone's wearing it on the street as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The drawbacks is probably like we are less tolerant towards differences. For example, we mentioned discrimination of our episode, and this is happening also towards genders, towards if you have different interests, if you want to be a different kind of people, you also get discriminated somehow. It's because of this cultural background we have already.
So, so we wanted to share with you some of obviously our experiences and the different viewpoints on this kind of matter. Obviously, it's not comprehensive. We just looked at several different angles, but hopefully you can kind of digest it and think about it as well, and perhaps it can maybe open your eyes to some different ways of looking at the issue.
I would say for a lot of Chinese, we need to kind of reflect our actions. We need to acknowledge there are a lot of discriminations actually in the society, because by acknowledging it, we can improve it. We should say no to that kind of actions, even sometimes it's unconsciousness to the people from the Western countries. We would also maybe bring you some insights towards the history and culture inside China. So you probably have different views or other views towards the problems we're talking about.
And at the end of the day, we all hope that discrimination can be lessened in the world, and people can learn to kind of learn from each other and just live harmoniously. Thank you very much for watching, and see you again next week.